Hello and welcome to a for context video on Elizabethan and Jacobean England. So to start with, this was a time period often referred to as the Tudors and the Stuarts, but the Elizabethan and the Jacobean is a smaller part of that. So Elizabeth is the last Tudor monarch and James I is the first Stuart monarch. And this was a time period really of controlling leadership, religious strife, a renaissance in art, a development of humanism, developments in science and culture, and there was a belief in the monarch's divine right to rule, which meant that God had chosen them. Therefore, to question them was to question God. There were loads of big events in the reigns of these two monarchs. So I'm just going to go very quickly through some of those to kind of get your brains going, familiarise yourself with the time period. So in 1485, this is the very beginning of the Tudor dynasty, Henry Tudor is victorious in the War of the Roses and he becomes Henry VII, the first Tudor king, and he marries Elizabeth of York, and that's where the Tudor rose come from. It's the Yorkist rose and the Lancastrian rose, the white rose and the red rose put together to form the Tudor rose. So that happens in 1485 and 1486. In 1509, Henry VIII becomes king. He's married Catherine of Aragon. She was originally married to his elder brother, who was supposed to be king, whose name was Arthur, but he dies, and therefore Henry becomes heir to the throne, and he also marries her wife. He's supposedly allowed to do this initially, even though he has to ask the Pope for special dispensation, because Catherine and Arthur's marriage was never consummated. They never had sex, so their marriage never technically properly existed, according to the Tudors. And that's why Henry VIII is able to marry her. Later, this comes into question. By 1534, Henry is then breaking from Rome. He's breaking from the Catholic Church. He is destroying all the monasteries, taking all of their land and all of their money, which is why he is able to effectively found the British Navy by using money that he had taken from the church, because the church is now the state. They are no longer two separate things. There is no discussion between the Pope and the monarch about what the right thing to do is. The monarch is head of both. So head of the church and head of the state. So he gets all the money, all of the land, all of the stuff, all of the power. Now, of course, from primary school, you'll probably remember that the argument he gives for divorcing Catherine of Aragon, which is why he breaks from Rome and the Catholic Church, is because she had given birth to a daughter called Mary, was getting older, and had not given birth to a son and heir. So he divorces Catherine of Aragon, marries Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn supposedly commits adultery. She's accused of committing adultery with her brother, which is very unlikely. It's basically an early version of a show trial, and then she's executed. And she's obviously had one child. She gives birth to Elizabeth, who then becomes Elizabeth I. He then has 4 more wives, obviously. So Jane Seymour, who gives birth to a son, Edward, Anne of Cleves, who he said looked like a horse, Catherine Howard, who was very young and really did cheat on Henry and also gets beheaded, and she's cousin of Anne Boleyn, and then finally Catherine Parr, who's actually responsible for the education of Henry's children. So she deserves more credit than she gets. So when Henry VIII dies, of course, it's not his oldest child that becomes monarch, it's his boy child. So Edward VI becomes king in 1542. When he dies in 1553, so a relatively short reign, he nominates Lady Jane Grey to be queen because she's a Protestant and of age. And then his sister Mary finds out about it, has her arrested, put in the Tower of London, and she's executed. So she's only technically queen for 9 days, but has no coronation. Then she's replaced with Mary I, obviously in the same year, 1553, who becomes known as Bloody Mary. She is a Catholic. So far we've swung from Catholic to Protestant, and now we're swinging back to Catholic again. She's actually only on the throne for 5 years, has quite a reputation to rack up in 5 years. And then in 1558, Mary I dies, Bloody Mary gone, and is replaced by Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I rules for 45 years. She is the 3rd longest reigning monarch, behind Elizabeth II and Queen Victoria. So 3 top reigning monarchs, all women. And Elizabeth I is Protestant, so now swing back to Protestant again. So that's Catholic to Protestant, Protestant to Catholic, and now back to Protestant. And this is a really big problem. It continues to be a really big problem throughout Elizabeth's reign and James's reign and all the way through the Tudor period. When Elizabeth comes to the throne, half the country are Protestant and half the country are Catholic. Trying to please both of those halves is near on impossible. She does something where she tries to find the middle way. James I tries to continue with things like this. Charles I does a really bad job of it. marries a Catholic, not great. James II, Charles II has loads of parties. James II, who we'll talk about in a minute, actually converts to Catholicism. So we swing back to Catholic again. So a time of real instability, particularly when it comes to religion. And at this time, religion's super important. So it feeds into absolutely everything. During Elizabeth's reign, you see things like priest holes. You've got Jesuit and seminary priests. Seminary priests secretly did mass for Catholics. Jesuit priests actively sought to convert English people to Catholicism. That's why Elizabeth tended to have quite a lot of them executed, which led to the priest holes, where people would have holes in their houses where they could hide their Catholic priests. But if you were found to be hiding one, you'd be executed along with them. You've got the issue with Mary, Queen of Scots during her reign. Lots of people wanted her to be queen because she was Catholic. Elizabeth eventually has her executed because she's embroiled in at least one, probably more, plots to have Elizabeth assassinated. So because of something called the Bond of Association, you don't need to know that in English, but if you still don't know and you do history, I'd look it up. After the Babington and Throckmorton plots, Mary Queen of Scots is executed. When Elizabeth dies, of course, she's ruled for 45 years. She's 63 years old. She's had a pretty good time, although the country's going off her. But within a couple of decades, most people in England are looking back to Elizabeth's reign as a golden age because they don't really like Charles I. During Elizabeth's reign, you've got rivalry with Spain, lots of exploration, loads and loads of change. But of course, when she dies, aged 63, she has not married, so she has no children. Now, the famous line is that she was supposedly married to her country. Lots of fairly ungenerous historians would probably argue that she was just a bit indecisive and didn't get who she wanted, and therefore they kind of made up this image, and that's why she starts wearing very, very pale makeup. That's why they're always kind of trying to represent her as the Virgin Queen, hence naming the colony of Virginia after her. So basically, some historians, ungenerously, think this is more of a PR thing than a real thing, but it is what she said in speeches, so we'll run with it. In 1603, James I comes to the throne. He is also James VI of Scotland, so he sort of unites England and Scotland, but unofficially. There is no Act of Union yet. They are not considered the same country, the same nation. None of that has happened. He just happens to rule both. So he's James VI of Scotland and James I of England. Before this, he is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. So after all that fuss, he becomes the son anyway, and becomes the king. So that's a big waste of time, really. Before this point, in the 1590s, James I has written a book called Demonology. Now, demonology is a very interestingly spelt word, not at all how you'd think to spell it, which is basically a book about witches. He was a little bit paranoid about witches, and by the late 1500s, 1600s, so it's the 17th century, there is a rampant belief in witchcraft, and a couple of peaks in accusations of witchcraft, which are largely in the late 1500s, largely because of bad harvests, and also again in the 1620s and the 1640s. Those are the time periods we would refer to as the witch craze, but there is belief in witchcraft all the way through, from the medieval period really, but they didn't think that those witches were bad. They weren't doing deals with the devil. These witches definitely doing deals with the devil. But there's a belief in witchcraft all the way through, even into the 1700s, up until when you're getting to really scientific Reformation and the Renaissance, not the Renaissance. What do I want? It'll come to me. So lots of scientific discovery, and that needs people to stop blaming old women for everything that goes wrong. During James I's reign, of course, there's a gunpowder plot in 1605, where lots of Catholics gang up and try and explode Parliament with James I in it. Guy Fawkes is often the most talked about. He's the one found with the matches underneath Parliament. It's largely believed to have been led by a man called Robert Catesby. There was an excellent series on iPlayer called Gunpowder, which is probably worth a look. In 1607, the first successful colony is founded in Jamestown, named after James I. Although there is a little bit of cannibalism at various points, it is the first successful colony in the Americas. In 1611, the King James Bible is published. So this is like James's version of the Bible. It's one of the most famous versions of the Bible. And 1620, Pilgrim Fathers, who are basically Puritans in England who are feeling persecuted because of their religion. So they leave a Protestant swinging towards Catholic country and go to America looking for religious freedom. And a lot of those kind of very strict Christian attitudes that sort of still exist in some parts of America really come from those Pilgrim Fathers. And then James I dies, is replaced by Charles I. There's the English Civil War, when Charles I is executed in January 1649. They don't really know what to do for a bit. And then he's officially replaced by Oliver Cromwell, who is Lord Protector, not King. And he rules for a bit and then dies, and then they don't know what to do again. They make his son Lord Protector for a bit. I think his name's Richard. He's rubbish. So they get rid of him and they replace him with Charles II. Charles II is famous for being the party king. There's an excellent Horrible History song. He had 14 children, none of whom by his actual wife. And that's at least 14 by 13 mistresses, some of which are very famous in their own right. Then, of course, we have James II, William and Mary and Anne. And throughout this time period, you've got large rises in taxes. You've got the wool trade going because we're getting cotton and stuff from colonies and from other places in the world. And England has always relied on wool as an export and to use stuff. So that's kind of going away. So there's inflation, there's unemployment, there's starvation, there's desperation, there's bad harvests. So if you're wealthy, you're probably still okay. But if you're poor, it's not great. A really nice quote, which I think sums up the Jacobean period, is a quote from James I. And he said, "That which concerns the mystery of the king's power is not lawful to be disputed, for that is to wade into the weakness of princes." Here suggesting that any questioning of him is wrong. It's the complete and utter belief that the monarch is the representation of God on earth, in Britain, in England, so therefore must be listened to. So that's the first half. In the second part of this video, I'm going to talk about, well, everybody else, ordinary people in this time period.